Dr. Robert Malone, thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Well, thanks a lot for having me on. I understand I'm following the great Pierre Corey.
Yes, you are, man. I spoke to him yesterday. He's just such a lovely guy to speak with. Like he's so warm, and I'm gonna be honest. I'm nervous to talk to all of you guys, and like he was a great way to start because he just kind of put me at ease right away. I'm not.
He's a big teddy bear, isn't he?
He is, man. He is, and the conversation went really well, and I'm confident our conversation is going to go the same way. So I've been following you ever since you first appeared on the Dark Horse podcast, way back with Steve Kirsch, and I just found your story and everything you had to say so fascinating. So, could you just quickly outline your involvement in the creation of the mRNA technology that is currently used in the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines?
Sure. I guess to start off with, here's a quick scan of some of the many patents that I've been issued that cover the technology and also further advances in the technology involving positively charged fats and the structure of these cationic lipids and their formulation, etc. Let's see. So where does this all begin? I can go all the way back to when I was an undergraduate in a pathology lab at UC Davis, focused on breast cancer and learning the craft of molecular virology, working for a full professor who was one of the earliest molecular pathologists and had just come from a sabbatical in a laboratory at UCSF that had just won Nobel Prizes for the two primary investigators for the discovery of oncogenes. And I was allowed to go into this laboratory. I came in with a real work ethic because I had spent since I was 12 working for wages and have always approached everything with a strong work ethic. And I just took to the laboratory, even though I was continuing with my degree in biochemistry. And that's where I learned how to work with DNA and RNA and isolate both of those molecules and analyze them, etc. And the laboratory was focused on insertional mutagenesis, so the integration of a retrovirus into the genome of mice that was associated with breast cancer. And it was a way to discover new oncogenes and new tumor suppressor genes. So that was my original background. And while I was there, the other senior professor at University of California, Davis Department of Pathology in the School of Medicine, that was also acting as a mentor, Murray Gardner, together with some people, Preston Marks and others at the Primate Center, made a series of discoveries involving the role of a retrovirus of a particular type, a lentivirus, in causing a immunosuppression kind of immunodeficiency syndrome in monkeys. And that was right at the very onset of the HIV crisis and outbreak and that whole explosion of research. So I cut my teeth in these dual areas of retrovirology for breast cancer and gene discovery, and the role of lentiviruses and other retroviruses in causing immunodeficiency. And I got to see big science and big politics in that context. I did well enough that I was given an MD PhD scholarship and accepted into Northwestern University in Chicago, where I worked for a couple of years as a medical student. And then neither my wife nor I, having grown up in California, were very happy with life in Chicago, and we had a new baby. And I decided, and frankly, the science at University of Northwestern University Medical School wasn't quite what I was used to at UC Davis. Maybe I was spoiled. And so I applied for other graduate programs and got into the one that I had hoped to get into because I wanted to be a gene therapy researcher using retroviruses, and was accepted into UC San Diego and then into the postdoctoral laboratory, highly competitive, of a gentleman named Dr. Inder Verma, who eventually became the lead person at the Salk Institute. And at the time was very focused on retroviral gene therapy. And while I was there as a graduate student, I focused on how do retroviruses assemble RNA. And in order to ask the questions, the scientific questions that I wanted to ask, I had to develop a whole new system for manufacturing large quantities of RNA, making it so that there was what's called a reporter gene. I actually pioneered the use of luciferase as an RNA reporter gene and use in vivo in animals. I had spent some time in a laboratory on the main campus that had done the discovery work on the use of luciferase as a reporter gene. And then I adapted that for RNA and for animal work. And had a series of really breakthroughs in retrospect that gave rise, really birthed non-viral gene therapy. And some of those involved the delivery of messenger RNA into cells and tissues, first in frogs, then in chick embryos, frog embryos, chick embryos, and then eventually in mice. And this was not what I had intended to do. It was not my focus. But having had a background in both gene therapy and vaccinology, because of my time at UC Davis and the work with the HIV, and then some subsequent work I did with influenza and influenza vaccine development, it was a very short leap for me to realize that one could use RNA both as a new kind of drug, particularly because the RNA is very short-lived. And so the core idea was that you could use RNA basically for non-viral gene therapy, but if there were adverse events, in other words, if there were toxicities, the RNA would degrade rapidly and you just wouldn't dose it again. So that resolved one of the key problems with retroviral gene therapy and integrating vectors. So then having come up with that idea and filed the patent disclosures, the next step was, well, what good is it? Is it good enough to cure muscular dystrophy or cystic fibrosis or any of the other, sickle cell anemia? And the answer is no, it wasn't very efficient. And so what could it be used for? And it was a very small intellectual leap to say, oh, we could use it for vaccine purposes. So that's basically the short version of the genesis of the technology. I developed the methods for producing purified RNA at large scale, hadn't been done before. The structure demonstrated that the structure of the RNA, including certain elements, had to be in a certain way with certain elements. And I proved that that was the case. That hadn't been done before. I worked with others to apply a new delivery system that had been developed for DNA to RNA. That was the cationic lipid nanoplex technology. And then demonstrated that it would work both for producing a reporter protein, a foreign protein in a variety of cells and tissues, and then left the Salk in the middle of a massive patent battle between the Salk Institute and UC San Diego, in which I got caught in the crossfire, and joined a small biotech startup called Vical. I brought all my technology and reagents over from the Salk, carried on with my work. They allowed me to have a little skunk works. I think their total investment was about $30,000, including my salary. And we reduced that to practice, showing I built RNAs that would express various AIDS proteins, HIV proteins. And we used those and RNAs expressing flu proteins to show that you could generate immune responses in mice. And then we filed a bunch of patents. And the patents sat there for years. I left and went back to finish medical school. The company insisted that I not carry on with my research, that they owned all that research that I did. I did not get rich. That's a rumor. I got $1 for my efforts, and no patent royalties. And the company Vical sold the DNA and RNA rights to a company called Merck and Merck Vaccines. Merck was very excited. They published a couple papers about use of DNA vaccines for influenza vaccine development, but nothing ever came of it. They invested over $1 billion and they could never make the DNA vaccines work. But they weren't interested in the RNA, and neither was Vical, because it was believed that it would be too difficult to manufacture. And so it sat there. They did everything they could legally to keep anybody else from developing it, but they didn't develop themselves. And they also did what they could to keep me from working on it further once I became an academic. And so that's where it sat until the patents expired. And then both investors and the government in Germany, and in particular the CIA through DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, funded a program to try to move RNA vaccination as a technology forward. That capitalized Moderna. German government money helped capitalize BioNTech. And they kind of perked along trying to do things. There was another company that's still out there that was a competitor, one that Vical had very aggressively tried to shut down earlier, called CureVac, that was funded by Mr. Elon Musk. And that company basically stayed with the version of the technology that I had come up with. But Moderna and BioNTech went off on a tangent with modified mRNA, incorporating a modified pseudouridine molecule that was based on the discoveries of Carrico and Weissman. RNA vaccination that the world has been subjected to was really the enabling technology came from University of British Columbia and the laboratory of Dr. Peter Cullis, and the various companies that he spun out. I think Acuitas is the most recent one. So it was really a travesty with the Nobel Prize. The prize was given not for the discovery of the core technology. So it was given for these vaccines. So the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, and given to Carrico and Weissman under the belief that their discoveries involving pseudouridine were what made this all possible to do this so rapidly. But the honest truth is that it was the laboratory at University of British Columbia and Peter Cullis, with their advances in the formulation and delivery technology, that is really what made it possible. And their technology and advances and insights are used by all three of those companies, BioNTech, Moderna, and CureVac. So it's for me, I wasn't involved in these vaccines, and so it doesn't particularly bother me. I could have used the money that I didn't get the Nobel Prize. But it is really not correct scientifically and technically that Carrico and Weissman were given the award and Dr. Cullis was overlooked. And I know you're Canadian, so I highlight this, but it's with all sincerity. I've known Mr. Cullis, Dr. Cullis, for decades, not very closely, but occasionally within the field, and certainly been very aware of his work. And it was not appropriate that he was not recognized at this time, in my opinion. But I'm sure he's quite a wealthy man. Acuitas has done well. They've generated all kinds of royalty revenues. And rumor has it that Mr. Trudeau's family is a major investor in that company, although I've never seen the documentation to prove that. But so the story goes. Maybe some of the royalties go back to Cuba. Who
knows? Yeah. Actually, I'm originally from Vancouver, so it's even closer to home than
okay.
than originally thought. So I want to just
story.
That's fantastic. That's
Short version.
amazing. I've it's funny. I've listened to you tell that story probably a million times, and it never wears off on me. It's so fascinating. So, but the question I want to ask is, and it's the question that's never asked, is what is the difference between your original invention and the mRNA tech that's actually in the vaccines? Like, what's
Two main things. And the Cullis formulation actually incorporates some aspects that we pioneered in my laboratory, particularly the use of cholesterol in the formulation. The positively charged fats that I first worked with and then developed a number of other ones that were patented and licensed, and you can still buy them, I think, from Promega. They were all quaternary amines. So the nitrogen that carries the charge has 3 methyl groups and then a carbon nitrogen bond. So it's got 4 molecules that are covalently bound to it, and that forces it to have a positive charge in all, basically across the entire range of pH, of biological pH. What Mr. Cullis did, and his group and some others contributed, was to start working with what's called tertiary amines that are, so these are nitrogens that carry a positive charge when there's a more acidic environment, and then are neutral or slightly polar in a less acidic environment with less protons. And so it turns out that together with some modifications to the formulation and some just kind of empiric testing, synthesis and testing again and again and again, as was done in my laboratory and also at a large biotech company in Boston, where thousands and thousands of these molecules were synthesized and then tested. In Cullis's lab and some others, they came up with some novel chemical structures through this kind of repetitive development process. And they were characterized by a tertiary amine as opposed to a quaternary amine. And then they were formulated with cholesterol. Another thing that Cullis group did was incorporate the use of polyethylene glycol. So this is kind of a benign form of antifreeze that's attached to the surface of these particles, self-assembling particles, which keeps them from glomming onto each other. The polyethylene glycol falls off once injected into the patient. And then other than that, the formulation tech is pretty similar to what I used. There's fusogenic lipids, as we used back then, of various types, plus the cholesterol, et cetera. So there's the chemical structure and formulation.
Okay, everybody, before we continue, Dr. Malone's internet connection, everything was just shut down on his side. So you're hearing this smashed together because I lost Dr. Malone for like 10 solid minutes. I got to ask you, is this something that happens to you like from time to time?
This is all it. Early on, I had some really hostile activity. And for instance, I was specifically blocked by the New England Journal of Medicine and Science Magazine and some of those other things. And certainly, this is a fairly sophisticated uplink. Mm-hmm. We use Starlink and Verizon as a backup, and they both come into a switch that has balanced load server software, so it can flip back and forth. And it all comes through a dedicated firewall, custom-built computer that sits up underneath the Starlink box. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of attacks all the time because it's a commercial Starlink pipe. So it's perceived from the outside. You see it as if it's a major commercial entity with a big pipeline. And so that just seems to bring the vultures in, calling the pigs. But I've never had anything quite like what just happened.
Yeah, that was spooky. So okay,
so to speak.
so
Um,
yeah, so
so in any case, we were talking about the what is different about the technology as deployed from what I had worked with back in the day in the late 80s and early 90s. And so we were talking about the differences in the chemical structure and formulation of the positively charged fats. And then we were just a moment ago talking about the use of pseudouridine or methylated pseudouridine in the Moderna and BioNTech products, which is the invention of Carrico and Weissman, for which they received the Nobel Prize. Other than those things, the tech is pretty much identical. The method that is used for manufacturing the RNA, while it's scaled up and commercialized, uses the same enzymes. The structure of the RNA is fundamentally the same with some modifications. The open reading frame that encodes spike protein is codon optimized. I did not use codon optimization for the luciferase open reading frame, but the incorporation of the cap and poly-A tail, the use of T7 RNA polymerase, the use of a plasmid DNA template, the degradation of the DNA for purification, which we now know wasn't done very well in the case of these vaccines. And all of that is pretty much as I developed back then. And then the way to apply it, the use is exactly what I had imagined and anticipated, and then worked with others to reduce it to practice, which means to show that it actually worked in animals back in the late 80s and early 90s. But as I mentioned, it all got put on hold, put in the freezer, because these two companies, Vical and its management and Merck Vaccines, believed that there was no future in using RNA, and they just wanted to focus on the DNA versions of all this. So that's the major differences. And then, of course, if we talk about what are the toxicities, spike is a toxin. The payload, the thing that's being produced, is intrinsically toxic in a variety of different ways. So that was ill-advised. And the methylated pseudouridine is immunosuppressive. We were just talking about, because it's necessary to suppress the inflammatory response to get an optimal response to the RNA, or that's the thesis of Carrico and Weissman. CureVac would disagree. Their product seems to work perfectly fine without pseudouridine or methylated pseudouridine. And I think those are the main differences. And the use of the pseudouridine or methylated pseudouridine makes the molecule last for months as opposed to hours, which is kind of a key difference, both in terms of, in a positive way, of making a lot more protein using the method, and in a negative way, the molecule, with its immunosuppressive activities and its ability to produce this toxic protein, sticks around in your body for a very long time, which is not what we were told. That's another one of the lies that were spread by Pfizer and Moderna to physicians early on, that these modified mRNA-like molecules had the same short half-life that regular mRNA does. So I hope I've answered that question.
Totally. I'm not going to lie. I understood maybe 40-50% of it, but I'm sure there are people out there who totally get it. So I got to ask, you referenced the spike protein and the toxicity of it. Were Pfizer and Moderna aware of how toxic the spike protein was as they were creating the formulation for these vaccines?
I don't know what they were aware of. And one of my rules here all the way through has been to not pretend to be able to read people's minds. And so unless I saw a document that had been FOIA'd or something from Moderna leadership or BioNTech leadership, I don't even want to speculate about what they knew or didn't know. Clearly, the FDA and Health Canada and European Medicines Agency and Medical Research Health Council in the UK all took a very unusual, rushed approach to this, where they did not insist on the same standards of rigor that are normally applied, certainly to gene therapy products or to vaccine products or to DNA vaccine products, which is the closest thing. And they seem to give these RNA-based or modified RNA-based products a pass at doing most of the things that are normally required to ensure that products are safe, effective, pure, and not adulterated. And now we know that these products, at least to my eye, appear to meet the criteria of adulteration in that they have significant contamination with small DNA fragments. So I don't know what they knew about spike. This all traces back to research that was done in vaccine development with SARS-1 and the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, MERS, in which it was the candidate vaccines that were developed all focused on the use of this external protein which generates neutralizing antibodies. That's the spike that sticks out from the surface of the virus. Very similar to influenza with its hemagglutinin protein, which is a major target for the influenza vaccines. It's hard to believe, and I spoke about this on the Brett Weinstein podcast, that it's hard to imagine that there wasn't an awareness in those that were spearheading the development of these products, particularly at the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, that there might well be toxicity associated with administering a biologically active spike protein, given that it binds to ACE2 and TMPRSS, proteins involved in key regulatory processes in cells and biology in general and medicine. Hard to imagine, but as I said on Brett's show so long ago, the belief was that they had tweaked these molecules in various ways that would cause them to stay on the cells that were producing them, and that they wouldn't become free and circulate in the body. And my criticism then was that even though they'd published that they believed this was the case, clearly they didn't do a good enough job, because we now know that happens. And so, and that contributes to the toxicity. So it's hard to know what Barney Graham and those at the Vaccine Research Center that were driving a lot of this knew, and what they didn't know. Mm-hmm. It's clear in retrospect that everything was rushed. It was all jammed through in a very short period of time. I think probably there was a lot of excitement and a lot of, let's call it esprit de corps, to be kind, and maybe less thinking and questioning than would normally happen in drug development, and that more thinking and less publicity might have got us to a better, safer product. But that's all armchair quarterback right now.
Yeah. So vaccines, obviously we know the story now at this point, mandates and, all of the authoritarian, disgusting behavior that went on around that on the part of our governments. So we start seeing these signals popping up, and we start seeing side effects. And now we're at a point where the excess death numbers are through the roof, according to the insurance industry, which really are the people that you want, who are going to be tracking it, right? Because it's in their best.
So we get the wording right. This is excess all-cause mortality, and that we're talking about. And we have to be very careful because there are other confounders here, like, for instance, suicide, depression, the economic impact of the lockdowns, the unemployment. Unemployment is directly related to increased mortality.
Mm.
There were massive economic disruptions. Businesses were destroyed, people's livelihoods were destroyed, their families were torn up. And so we do have to be, I'm being a little overly cautious here, because undoubtedly we're going to have a whole cluster of critics come out since we're talking about this. So I just want to acknowledge that those excess all-cause mortality data, while they're quite compelling and difficult to interpret as not having a strong component of vaccine-related mortality and morbidity disease, there are other confounding variables. So it's really hard to put your finger on what the number is, because you can't easily control for all these variables. But what's particularly striking is that 2020 and 2021, until the vaccines were deployed, was not generally associated in retrospect with a very high excess all-cause mortality rate, if any. It pretty much in most nation states appears to be the deaths on average appear to be running about what they were running in the prior years, until the vaccine products were deployed. And then suddenly you have this increase, and then it kind of tapers off. The slope of the increase tapers off in late 2022, 2023, as fewer people were taking the products, or those that were going to take them had already had their first 2 jabs and they decided they weren't going to have the boosters. But it's still continuing, and it appears to have shifted a little bit. Another one of the, and may be having more cancers, and that's worrisome. Physicians are reporting a considerable load of new onset autoimmune disease. That has many frontline physicians quite worried. That shows up as sickness, not as death necessarily. And what's intriguing about all this is that many of those insurance statistics are coming from insured populations that are fully employed and younger. That normally would be at fairly low risk for death. And of course, if you're an insurance executive, this is particularly alarming because you've written an insurance policy. And so they are now having to kind of readjust some of their actuarial tables based on what's happening. And I think they're at a bit of a loss, the whole industry is, about what to do here. Is this going to be a short-term blip that is more than 2 statistical deviations above the baseline, which is to say it's a 1 in 1,000 probability or more that something like this would happen? So I think they're still scratching their heads as they're watching these policies go out the door for younger, fully employed individuals that were insured and shouldn't have been getting sick and dying in these kinds of numbers. So I agree. And of course, a tip of the hat to Ed Dowd and his colleagues and so many others that have focused on this very early. And after I think it was Midwest Life or something like that, data came out, must be almost 2 years ago now. So yes, there's something rotten in Denmark. It's probably multifactorial, but it's hard to, it certainly looks like it has a vaccine component. And then there are all these data that now, we still hear this mantra repeated, and we heard it the other day from the FDA, in denying that there's any risk for these short DNA fragments that are also being delivered to people that they didn't know about. And the FDA's mantra is, well, this is safe and effective, and it's been over 1 billion doses have been administered. But the way they set up their monitoring system to only look at things that happen within 14 days through the VAERS system, so the short-term adverse events, they won't pick up the cancers and other longer-term things like autoimmune disease. There was a lot of data manipulation and suppression of adverse events and deaths and myocardial signals in the original clinical trials that were blatantly fraudulent in their data analyses. And a marked unwillingness on the part of Health Canada, FDA, EMA, et cetera, to investigate the safety signals that are abundantly present. And furthermore, in the States, we have clear documentation of aggressive attempts by the government to suppress information about myocarditis, even though they knew that it was happening, and they knew that it was happening at a significant rate, and that it was not a short, transient, mild syndrome. So there's abundant evidence that the governments have really conspired to suppress information about the adverse events, which is the exact opposite of what should occur with informed consent. We had, there's in the UK, it's been revealed that there were agreements between the US government and the British government to suppress any information about adverse events. We're learning on almost a daily basis about the weaponized censorship and suppression of information. Just today, Jim Jordan came out with documents regarding that censorship that preceded the election, that were basically censorship deployed by the Special Election Integrity Commission that included censoring me. So I now have the dubious fame of having been censored by the federal government and having documentation for it. I've always known that that was the case, but now I've got smoking guns. And it just continues to roll out. And of course, the thing that originally got me going on speaking out was having spoken at length with a Canadian physician from Toronto who reported to me what was going on in Canada with the solicitation and enticement of children to take these products.
6 months and older. Yeah.
Yeah. And the suppression of physician reports of adverse events. And that physician wishes to remain nameless, but he has now been required to submit to the re-education training, and he will have to write his letter of contrition that demonstrates that he's sufficiently apologetic and contrite for providing vaccine exemptions and prescriptions for ivermectin to patients. The whole thing is shocking for those of us that thought that we were living in free democratic republics or open societies. I've been blown away, particularly by Canada. I've been into Canada a few times. I used to show draft horses up there. I had many Canadian friends. Always been struck by how civilized Canada was in the traditional British way. Very friendly. And of course, during the 60s, Canada was believed to be the refuge for the Vietnam War protesters. And then to have Canada just go all in on these overtly totalitarian, authoritarian policies under Mr. Trudeau and having much of the population go along with it has been amazing.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think for all of the reasons you just outlined, our population has been fairly apathetic for a very long time. And it wasn't an issue in the past because Canada has always been a pretty balanced country, right? Like we were never a world power, but we were never a third world nation. We rode the coattails of the United States forever. And, nobody messed with us because they knew that if they did, we're right on the US border. So good luck with that one. And but now we're in a situation where our leadership is hand in hand with the World Economic Forum.
Right.
And so we are watching all of this stuff develop and unfold. And to be honest with you, that's a big part of the reason why I left British Columbia and came to Alberta, because it became clear to me during the pandemic that I need to be with the fighters. And in Canada, Alberta is, you could kind of compare it to Texas, where we're considered Canada's Texas, and we're actually very close.
Familiar. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
familiar.
Yeah. So like when the Freedom Convoy happened, the trucker protest in Ottawa, a lot of those people came from Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so I said to myself, I got to get my family to where the fighters are, because when this fight begins, that's where I need to be. And so, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, culturally, we've been very docile and very apathetic for a long time. And now that's coming back to bite us. A lot of what's happening here in Canada would never go over well in the United States, because, the US fosters much more of a patriotic spirit.
But the very similar things happen in New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah.
It's been a great disappointment, I think, for many.
Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, just as an example, right? Like when I relaunched this podcast, I reached out to a very small group of people, and there were a couple of Canadians in that loop, and yourself and two others who are way, in terms of profile, way more important for me to speak with. The Canadians gave me the runaround. You guys, it's it's just the way you guys operate in the US, right? It's like either it's a big yes or it's a big no. Get lost, right? And so it's just a very culturally, that's the difference between us, right?
yeah, so you should reach out to Byron Bridle.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this sequencing group in Guelph that has been doing a lot of the work with the short DNA fragments that probably deserves a podcast. So they're there, but they are all being harassed and defamed and suffering character assassination and everything else. And of course, you all got to wake the world up. You had the questionable privilege of waking up the world to the threat of debanking.
Mm-hmm.
That was not just a national shock, that was a global shock, I think, to the system, where none of us, I think, or very few, had anticipated that banking would be weaponized in this way as a tool for social control.
Right. Yeah. So I know you got to get going. You got another important discussion to have here in a few minutes. But just before you go, I want to talk to you very briefly about this World Health Organization pandemic treaty, the revisions currently being made to the existing regulations, and the new pandemic accord that's set to take effect. What, in your view, I mean, give us a quick overview of what it is and what the dangers are in your perspective.
Well, first off, the international health regulations were put in place years ago. And this is an update. So you're laying out two separate agendas. One is the Pandemic Health Treaty, and one is the updated international health regulations. And the IHR modifications were actually proposed by our government down here. I guess we're down under. We're not Aussies, but so it was actually our Health and Human Services that devised this scheme that would vest, together with the health treaty, the right of the World Health Organization to serve as the central global coordinating body for response to future public health outbreaks, would vest with Mr. Tedros or his Director General replacement the ability to unilaterally declare a public health emergency, would create a situation in which the World Health Organization would be authorized to guess the kindest word is surveil independent nation states for their willingness and ability to comply with the prescriptions that might come from a World Health Organization. And just to provide context, Mr. Tedros and the WHO are busy telling themselves what a great job they've done. But I think most of the rest of us think that they did an atrocious job during the COVID crisis and grossly misinterpreted what was happening in China. And then on the basis of that misunderstanding, propagated policies such as lockdowns across the world that were highly counterproductive and were completely misaligned with the prior consensus documents at WHO about how to manage a pandemic. So they just threw the rule book out the window, much like the regulators did, in a moment of panic, and said, "Oh, the Chinese have got it right, and so we're going to do what the Chinese did." Turns out that the backstory is that the Chinese used a very, very restrictive definition for death from COVID. And so the WHO and the national governments interpreted that the low mortality rate in the presence of the severe restrictions that were imposed was the consequence of the restrictions, when in fact it was the consequence of how the CCP was classifying COVID. And so they assimilated these very heavy-handed tactics, thinking that it was working in China, even though that had been their rules that they would never do anything like that. So this is the history of WHO recently. And of course, then we had, as another exemplar, the monkeypox outbreak, which the initial committee to help advise Mr. Tedros decided should not be an international health crisis. And then Mr. Tedros reorganized that committee to make it more representative of basically the gay population and, let's say, more sensitive to their interests, and resubmitted the request for the committee to endorse this as a world health crisis. And the committee, as I recall, voted 9-5 against declaring it a international health crisis, which Mr. Tedros declared was a tie, which he needed to step in and break and declare it a global public health crisis. So this shows the arbitrary and capricious nature of the WHO, which is, by the way, increasingly influenced by Mr. Gates, who has commercial interests in this because of the level of funding that Mr. Gates provided to the World Health Organization. So based on all this, the WHO believes that it deserves a fraction of a nation state's public health budget or health budget in general. And so this is the mechanism that's proposed to be funding these new capabilities to be housed at the World Health Organization and potentially also CEPI, is basically a tax on healthcare expenses from member states. Of course, the United States would be at the forefront of that, not just because of its population, but because of its excessive spending on healthcare. And so this would be a kind of a mandatory tax on nation states that they would have to, it's kind of like a tithe that they would have to give to the WHO so it can provide its excellent management. And then the WHO, under these new regulations in the treaty, would be able to mandate measures to be taken by independent nation states. So technically, they would be in a position of saying, the WHO would be in a position of saying, you need to take this vaccine or use these medicines or lockdown or whatever the procedures are. Now, that went through a round of discussion and revisions. The first one got blocked largely by Brazil and African states And it was pitched at the time that they were blocking its approval because of concerns about national sovereignty. But then what's kind of come out since then is that it really had more to do with that they felt that they weren't getting enough goodies from the first world. And so that's easily solved and apparently has been largely addressed, so that there's now things like the new RNA manufacturing plant that's going on and going down in Africa, et cetera, trying to enable these least developed countries or emerging economies to have some of their own capabilities in this area as kind of a quid pro quo to signing off on this. So still to be determined, but it is whether these are all going to move forward. The House in the United States has voted to defund the World Health Organization and to prohibit engagement and require a full Senate approval. The game that's being played in the United States is that technically, for most of the world, these are considered treaties. But in the United States, they're trying to sidestep this because a treaty requires 2/3 ratification in the Senate. And so they don't think they can hit a 2/3 majority in the Senate to ratify this. And so they're using terms like, well, it's going to be a presidential agreement, or this kind of soft language. And on the side of the WHO, they've softened a lot of the language so that previous versions were more explicitly directive. You will do this, you will do that. And the new language has some kind of soft wiggle room in there, that these are suggestions, not requirements. Skeptics are not convinced that this softening of the wording has really changed anything substantial. And I guess there's not a whole lot of trust after the last 3 to 4 years of what we've been through. So that's my brief version. The main complaints about this has to do with loss of sovereignty and autonomy, and whether, and then underlying that is the observation that it's us, again, being generous, it's very hard to make a good case that the WHO did a good job during the COVID crisis or during the monkeypox outbreak. And so why should we give them a whole lot more money and a whole lot more global power? And the justification seems to be, well, we deserve it because we are the UN, and we have treaties with the World Economic Forum, and we all agree now that we need to have global response capabilities, and we're the globalist organization to do this, and therefore you should go along with our plans. That seems to be the core justification. And there are those like myself who have come to the point where we don't trust pretty much anybody, let alone globalists, and let alone the WEF and the WHO. I can tell you, I've been at the World Health Organization during the Ebola outbreak for a number of meetings, high-level meetings, and saw the Secretary General basically soliciting donations from my client, who had the rights to the Canadian Ebola vaccine that eventually got sold to Merck. And as that vaccine became more prominent in the WHO decision-making about which one to back, the Secretary General hit up the leadership of my client, asking, basically telling them that since now they're going to be on stage with the big boys like GSK and Pfizer, that they needed to pony up and make donations to the WHO, which I was shocked at. But then I learned much more about the history of corruption at the World Health Organization, which is long, deep, and rich. So this is not an international organization with integrity. It's highly compromised, highly politicized, and in my opinion, not to be trusted. So is that covered that topic enough?
Sir, I know you have to run and you literally left me with like the worst cliffhanger ever. I really hope that you and I get a chance to talk again someday because you just left me. I feel like the movie just ended on to be continued and I've been robbed of an ending here. Um,
I can give you an ending. I can give you an ending. So
okay.
for all your audience, after what we've been through, the core issues here are the fragmentations of our community, the fragmentation of our communities, our separation from each other, which enables the propaganda, psyops, and government control mechanisms to be inserted. And many people are to the point now where they want to have an authority figure tell them what to do. And then there's the 20% of the population that is basically in the hell no, I won't go mode. Those that are not readily hypnotized and not readily propagandized and are seeing through the machinations that are occurring here. And then we have the 60% of the population in the middle that kind of is flip-floppy and it'll go whichever way they think the wind blows.
Yep.
I think that for those of us, probably most of the people listening to your podcast, as Dr. Matthias Desmet teaches in his work on the psychological basis of totalitarianism, we have to keep speaking up. We will be attacked. We will be ridiculed. We will suffer character assassination if you're sufficiently prominent. And you have no moral choice other than to continue. Because if you don't continue to speak out in your family, in your community, in your workplace, and share truth, then the society will go even deeper into this hypnotic process that has overtaken them, that is the basis for totalitarianism. Totalitarianism being the key word there is totality. It's the whole culture.
Yep.
And you can replace Mr. Trudeau with Krista Friedland and nothing's going to change. Mm-hmm. And then you can replace Krista Friedland and there's going to be somebody else that comes up that is similarly authoritarian. Yeah, so long as Canadian society, driven by fear, believes that they need to have a strong authoritarian leadership, that's what you will get.
Yes.
And so my counsel to you is, despite the hardships, choose a role, whether it's teacher, mentor, parent, educator, or warrior, but choose something other than victim. Don't let them victimize you. Be strong and speak truth as best as you know it, for the sake of your children and everybody around you, so that they don't even go deeper into this hypnotic process that has surrounded all of us. And then try to rebuild community, connect with each other. Often communities of faith have been very resistant to all of this, but it doesn't have to be a community of faith. There's a lot of different ways to create community. You can create salons. You can all go harvest tomatoes together, whatever the thing is, or go work on cars together, whatever it is that brings you together as a community, or go enjoy winter sports there in Canada. But do it as a community. Don't try to focus on building community and community links rather than going solo. And I think that's how we best get out of this. And I always use the terms, the three words: integrity, respect for human dignity, and building community as the three things that we have to keep in our minds as we try to resist what is being imposed on us. So how about that as a capstone?
That was you know what, that was better than I could have ever imagined it. And while you were talking, I realized I gotta change my background here. Your background is way cool. I gotta get some certificate. All I got is a big ball of my boxing hand wraps in one of my wife's
You know what
crafts on the
works
wall.
really well is a velvet drape.
Yeah, I might have to do that. I might have to do that. But Dr. Malone, I know you have to run. Thank you so much for your time. And, just before you go, I do just want to say to you, because I've been dying to say this to you forever. Thank you so much for standing up and speaking out and talking to people like me, because realistically, sir, you're a doctor, you're an inventor, you're a scientist. You could have just sat back and let this all happen and not said anything. And I don't think anybody would have faulted you for it. And thank you for being courageous and speaking out.
Well, thanks. It's been kind of an in for a penny, in for a pound situation. Once you start being a dissenter or a whistleblower, you can't really back off. Or, I guess you could, but it would be a weenie way out.
That's right.
That's kind of not how I'm wired.
That's awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thanks for having me on.